Cecilia Chiacchio, and I'll introduce her. So Cecilia is professor, researcher, and elected member of the School Council at the Faculty of Humanities and Sciences of Education at the National University of La Plata. She teaches English literature and literature of the United States and is currently part of 2 research projects at the Center for Literatures and Comparative Literatures. And I apologize, I'm reading the English names of these centers and places. Her first project is titled The Distribution of the Sensible and English Literature, Aesthetic Poetics. And the second project is titled Non-Canonical Literatures, A New Distribution of the Sensible, Social, Ethnic, Linguistic, Gender, and Geopolitical Minorities. In both projects, Cecilia focuses on feminist dystopias, and she has read at several national and international conferences, published book chapters and academic articles, and co-edited the book Máscaras del Deseo. She received a National Endowment for the Humanities from the Embassy of the United States in 1995 and the Fulbright Grant in 2000. Without further ado, I present you Cecilia Chiacchio. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. That's like prehistory, but it's important because here we are. Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I'd like to thank again Facultad de Humanidades and the Embassy of the United States for this project and the opportunity of sharing these talks. To Ana Principe and Laura Spoturno for the great job in coordinating all this. Thank you to my colleagues, Meg, Alicia, and Laura for the incredible and impressive presentations which you gave. And of course, Fernando and Ignacio for being so supportive in the technical. Let's hope we don't need any extra help, but nevertheless, thank you for being there. Yeah. Well, my talk is going to be about dystopias and the posthuman. Let me share the screen first. Am I doing it correctly? Yeah. So, dystopias and the posthuman. And let me tell you that I have been, in some way, moving around dystopias and science fiction for some time. Not that I was a fan of science fiction or of dystopias earlier, but little by little I got involved into them. And once I read, first of all, I got interested in feminist literature after working with Maria Luisa Femenillas and working with gender studies. And so I have always had this crossroad between language, literature, and gender studies. And little by little I got involved into science fiction, but mainly with the genres of utopias and dystopias. And I got interested in how utopias and dystopias tended to accompany, or tended to nourish from and nurture at the same time feminist movements. How, for instance, in the 1960s, 1970s, with the moment of the second wave of feminism, utopias were so flourishing, and how then in the 1990s, 80s and 90s, suddenly dystopias took place or began to be more important. So all these things had always been interesting to me, and this is in some way what I'm doing now in the research project. That is, I'm working with dystopias, feminist dystopias, and mainly with Margaret Atwood in the project. And I'm beginning to work with dystopias and post-feminism. That is what I'm going to share with you today, what I have been reading so far and what I may continue doing. Let me see if I can move this here. So my talk is going to be divided into 2 parts, the same way as we had in the first session. The first part, I'm going to comment on critical dystopias and the posthuman and feminism, some general very basic comments to have the background. For then in the second part of the talk to make some comments about He, She, and It by Marge Piercy and Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich. So we'll start. Yeah. And in between, what we're planning to do in between is to have sessions of questions, yeah, after the posthuman feminism, and then questions at the end after the novels. So, dystopias. That's very difficult to define, I say. There's a very basic definition of dystopia that we can begin with. That is, the dystopias offer utopianism in general, that is the one that includes utopias, dystopias, and all the variants we may have, deal with alternative worlds that are different from the one of the readers and the authors and readers. And the difference between utopia and dystopia, the basic difference would be how close or far they get to a sense of perfection, if such thing is possible. Yeah, utopias closer, dystopias far from perfection. That is, the basic definition of a dystopia is that they offer an imagined world that is worse than that of the author and readers. So in general, in these dystopias, what we have is violence, perils, chaos, vulnerability, inequality, features that belong to our real world, our world, the one in which we find ourselves, but they are taken to an extreme, they are stretched to a maximum in dystopias. The procedure of imagining an alternative world presents first some difficulty in terms of referentiality. This was part of the discussion by scholars about, well, if this is an alternative world, it is a world that is non-existing. So where is the reference? Where should we find that reference if it is a non-existent world? Yeah. If the main feature of a dystopia is that it should create some kind of estrangement in the reader, if it should be perceived as so different from our world, where is the reference? In fact, it shouldn't be a problem. It shouldn't be a problem, because what dystopias do is to base their imagined alternative world in very concrete features of our current societies. Yeah, and they, as I said, they stretch them to maximum in a kind of hyperbole of our real world. In fact, we could speak of a double consciousness of fictionality in this. In fact, Catherine Snyder presents this idea. A double consciousness of fictionality in dystopia, in the sense that the main feature of dystopia then is that it should create estrangement, the perception of difference. But at the same time, to keep an admonitory tone, to keep an essential tone of dystopia, that is to act as a warning of what may happen to us if we continue this way. Readers should find some elements that should have some elements that are recognizable in the alternative world and in their own world. Otherwise, the admonitory tone would not work. So the estrangement acts as a hinge between that double consciousness, that world that is different, but the recognition that, the acknowledgement that some features of that world can be traced in our own current societies. This is necessary for the estrangement to work. Yeah? Now, the other point that we can discuss about dystopias has to do with, well, we say in this basic definition, we say that dystopias present an alternative world that is different from the world of the author, or our world. But whose world? Is it the authors? Is it the readers, the contemporary readers? How much time is that estrangement of the alternative world sustained? We can read a dystopia at some time and find that world as strange, and sometime later begin to see that it's more familiar than we would have wanted. I'm thinking, for instance, of Ray Bradbury's The Veldt, that short story from the 1950s in which he imagines a smart house. In the 1950s, I don't know, some people may have known about smart houses, but it was not the common feature that we could see, the common place that we could see. My parents and perhaps some of your grandparents would not imagine, would have thought that, well, a smart house would be crazy, pure imagination. You know? After some decades, 40 years, 50 years, the concept became more familiar, and now we know it's available. It depends, of course, on your economic condition and social conditions. Maybe it's not something that everybody has a smart house, but we know it exists. It's not only imagination. But some decades passed in between. But I think that one of the problems, one of the challenges that dystopias are facing now is the speed with which the advances in technology, make that span of time between the estrangement of the moment when the dystopia or the book was written and the moment when we read it as more familiar is shrinking more and more. I'm thinking, for instance, now in this respect, let me see if I can move this slide. With Margaret Atwood's book, Mad Adam, the first book in that trilogy, Oryx and Crake, is from 2003. And there, she imagines a world, the collapse of humanity. She imagines, the collapse of humanity, but before that collapse, she imagines a world that is ruled by genetic science and technology and genetic manipulation. And one of the species that is created in that world is the pigeons, that is a species of pigs that are raised to harbor organs to be used in transplants. That was 2003. Now, 2022, we have the first historic transplant of a porcine heart into an adult. So it's not too many decades. It's a little less than 2 decades between the imagined world being imaginative and the real world showing that world has become part of our life. No? This is what I mean with the speed of change, when I mean that this is a challenge that dystopias have, because they still need to create estrangement so that we see that what we are reading in that imagined world is a likely consequence for the future if we do not make any changes in the present life. So if the speed changes, if that span of time shrinks more and more rapidly, then the admonitory tone demands faster measures about our present world. So one other concept I like I think important about dystopias is to take them as thought experiments. Roberts, speaking about science fiction and what makes science fiction, he includes utopias and dystopias within science fiction. And he says that utopianism takes its force from philosophy and social sciences. Yeah? And I like that idea. I like it because I'm interested in that crossroad between dystopias and feminism. Yeah? And I think that idea that dystopias and utopias take from social sciences and from philosophy goes hand in hand with what Judith Butler says about fiction. Judith Butler says that the novels are a space where to develop theory. Yeah? And I like that idea, to read a novel as a place where to develop theory, both as a different kind of text to develop one's idea, that is, you can read it in an essay, you can read it in the novel, but also as a way of putting those theories into practice or testing those theories in imagined worlds. Ursula Le Guin also has a similar phrase when she commented on her writing of The Left Hand of Darkness. She said that the novel is the way she did her thinking. The novel expresses the process of her thinking. And that is a similar idea of having the novel as a space to develop theory, or to consider the novels as thought experiments. I'm not saying that dystopias are the space to develop theory. It's not the only or the ideal. I think it's a suitable space to develop theory and to show the process of thinking. And I think that it also helps in the fact that dystopias may act as mediators for an analysis of reality, for analysis of the social world in which we are. Mediators in the sense that when we read about an alternative world, we take it as it is a fictional world. There's a distance between that world and us that sometimes allows us to see some things as strange, things that may be familiar or maybe we have naturalized in our world, in our current societies. But we realize that those things are not natural when we read them in an imagined world. Coming back to The Left Hand of Darkness, for instance, you read of sex being taking periods and the same person being male or female, depending on the period in which they are. And that may help us, that distance of seeing that as a strange world, as something unusual, something imaginative, that may help us see that the question of male and female may be not so naturalized, or not natural. They have been naturalized, but it's not natural. Now, that's from this old times, 70s, but I mean, this is the kind of thing that I'm interested in dystopias, because they give us some distance to see the world, and we may be observing things as strange in the world, but then we come to realize, or that takes us back to our current world to see that, well, we have naturalized many things and we cannot see that they are naturalized, but we realize that when we see them in another world, in another imaginative world. Critical dystopias in particular. The critical dystopia is a dystopia closely associated with feminisms. This is Tom Moylan's. I'm taking from Tom Moylan, Raffaella Baccolini, Ilde Cavalcanti, but there are many writers, genre that has been widely studied. Moylan says that a feminist stance and methodology lie at the heart of the political and formal innovations of this body of work. And they agree on placing the critical dystopias as having a start in the mid-1980s. Yeah. What is specific about the critical dystopia is what they call a utopian impulse, or another phrase, what Moylan uses is a horizon of hope. Yes. What does that mean? In the traditional dystopia, the fact that there is an admonitory tone, the fact that there is a warning implicit in the dystopia, is in some way a hopeful note. But that hope remains at the level of author and reader, not within the narrative. The narrative is gloomy. But in the critical dystopia, what these critics observe is that within the narrative, within the imagined world, there appears some light, some utopian element, sometimes a minor one, sometimes more important, but there is always some hint of hope within the narrative. And that is one of the main innovations of the critical dystopia within the genre, having a horizon of hope within the narrative. Think, for instance, of The Handmaid's Tale by Atwood. This really gloomy world, dark, oppressive, and yet the fact that Offred can escape, and the fact that she can tell her story, the fact that she can record her story in tapes, and that those tapes reach the future, that is, the story is unveiled, is unfolded, that is the utopian impulse. Yeah. Personally, I have some doubts about how far that in that novel, the utopian impulse gets, because then the tapes are sarcastically manipulated by male academics. But nevertheless, the fact within the narrative, the fact that within the narrative, I mean, the male academics in the future make jokes about, made some patriarchal jokes about what happened, and that is not so hopeful. But nevertheless, the story survived, and Offred's voice, literally in the tapes, became possible. So that is an example of the utopian impulse that these critical dystopias have. There are other features that will, of course, overlap with postmodernism in some ways and with different feminist currents. There is, for instance, genre blending. So you have in dystopias other genres like slave narratives. Yeah, you translated Kindred. So that's an example of a dystopia in which the genre of slave narrative is included, and slave narrative is quite common within dystopia as a genre to be included. Literally slavery, or a more metaphorical slavery. Another feature, fluidity and hybridity, there is the favoring of hybridity or fluidity of nomadic subjects, subjecthoods. And the themes also reveal the accompaniment with gender issues and with feminisms. For instance, new themes become central in critical dystopias, having to do, for instance, with mother-child relationships, having to do with reproduction, with reproductive rights, with ecology. New themes that are discussed in those imagined alternative worlds, which of course respond to concrete events in our current societies. Atwood says that she bases all her speculative fiction. She doesn't like referring to her work as dystopia or science fiction. She says speculative fiction. So she said all her speculative fiction is based on things she heard of, even news in the newspapers. You know? For instance, in The Handmaid's Tale, she says that she read about fundamentalist groups that were so concerned with reproduction with reproduction, that those things that we see, that we read about in the novel, and we are shocked by the violence exercised, and those women who become sexual slaves for the sake of reproduction. Similar things were taking place in some fundamentalist groups in the States. And so what she did is, take that to an extreme, but she didn't invent it. You know, this is what she always makes a point of. Okay, resignation or resistance. There has been an abundance beginning from the 1980s, mid-1980s onwards. There has been an abundance of feminist dystopias, and dystopias in general, and feminist dystopias, lots of them. And some critics might suggest that in some way these could be some kind of resignation. That is, the fact that there are so many dystopias written speaks of a dystopian world that is surrounding us too close, and that the only admonitory tone that we can have is to despair. That is an interesting point, but in fact it seems to go against, it's interesting because it seems to go against one of the main features of critical dystopias, that is resistance. Because part of that utopian impulse is constructed in the narrative by the creation of underground movements who resist the authoritarian regimes. And it's not only that the dystopia is a resistance against something in the world, but within the narrative itself, there is a resistance to the oppressive authoritarian regime that might be governing. So resignation of resistance. I personally prefer resistance, and I personally prefer to see these texts as more than resignation, the idea of a growing awareness of how imperative change is in our lives. I think that should be highlighted in dystopias, and in connection with the how fast things change and how soon the imagined world becomes more recognizable, more familiar. That has to do with, well, there's an imperative of taking decisions now. And I think that one of the important things of this, as I made this wonderful, beautiful presentation about books and in a personal level at the beginning, and for me, this is said personal. This is personal too, and I think that dystopias take us to take this to think about how these dystopias may help us reflect and take measures or work for measures, and not only resist but act. Resistance in terms of actions and empowerment. Okay. So that's for the critical dystopia. Let me make some comments about the posthuman. Well, the posthuman, the same as the dystopias, has a long tradition, in philosophy and in literature. But nevertheless, I'm interested mainly, so far this time in my research, what I'm interested in is seeing the contribution that the posthuman studies can make to the study of dystopias, and feminisms. And what I found is that mainly there are two basic critiques of the posthuman that are closely linked to feminist dystopias: the critique to universality and the rejection of species supremacy. When I was listening to my other colleagues' sessions yesterday and today, I could see so many connections between what you said about solidarity and communities and interconnection, and that is part of the posthuman. The critique to universality. Well, what is this universal that is being criticized? The universal may seem like an old-fashioned term. When we speak of man of reason, may seem like, well, that comes from an old tradition. But unfortunately, it's still part of our societies. There has been for too long a trust in human capacities and on especially on rational capacities and on the concept of human progress. And even though these things have been questioned, there's still remnants of them in our societies, as if the universal, it is accepted, or it could be accepted, that the universal, the generic, really subsumes and acknowledges all diversity. As if diversity is not visible enough, or if the changes have not been radical enough, that we still perceive that a universal concept can acknowledge all the diversity instead of making it invisible. Let me make it safe. Making it invisible. Yes. Again, this might sound like too obvious, but yet we are still discussing, for instance, inclusive language. And there are still reactions against the use of a language that tries to make visible that the male, the he or él, does not necessarily include the rest of people. So it is ingrained in our society, and it is ingrained in our institutions. You know? So I think it's important to name it, to mention it, a critique to universality. But the universal, the concept of universal is not only, is on the one hand, this idea that, well, the idea of man, for instance, includes every human person. That's something that is challenged by posthumanism. Yeah? But that idea of universal is not only that, because that idea of universal is the belief that that person is an autonomous being. Let me see if it is. There's a comment, so let me just start. I remember the introduction that was Jame's tale. She mentions child stealing of the Argentinian generals as part of the subject she had in mind. True, Carola. Carola's commenting on the introduction to Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, where she mentions that she took information from the kidnapping, stealing of children in Argentina during the military government as part of something she had in mind in her writing. True. An example of what I was saying about having always a reference to reality. And yet, we know that those things happen, but sometimes reading about them in a book help us see them clearer and help them to take a distance and reflect upon what happened to us. Good. So the critique to universality then, on the one hand, the idea that the concept of man is not, what is challenged is a concept of man that seems to include every person. That is not accepted by posthumanism, that is challenged by the posthuman. The universal also implies that human, that man, that includes everyone, that man is autonomous, is independent, yeah? Has a conscience and is independent from the rest of the world. And that man that includes every person and is autonomous, independent, is at the center of the world. Those three aspects are part of the concept of universality that are being challenged by the posthuman. That is not accepted by the posthuman. The posthuman tries to show that that is not true. That is not what we should take for granted. The second point is the rejection of species supremacy, which is connected with the idea of being at the center, but not only being at the center, but being above. Yeah? That the human is above, first of all, that man, and here comes the question, man is above the rest. Well, who are the rest? If man is supposed to include everyone, then the rest should be the planet, should be animals, should be plant life. That's one way of seeing it. But in fact, the concept of man that is universal is not really universal, because the man that is at the center does not include what we usually call the others, does not really include women or other groups that are not the hegemonic power. So this idea of universality and species supremacy places a male hegemonic power above the rest, pretending to include everyone, while many of those everyones are left aside. That is a challenge that the posthuman poses. And Braidotti, there's a quotation here. She says, the posthuman proposes a new understanding of the human, not as an autonomous agent endowed with transcendental consciousness, but rather an immanent, embodied and embedded relational entity that thinks with and through multiple connections to others, both human and non-human, organic and inorganic other. Yeah. So it's and this is what I was referring to when I commented on the other talks in the sessions. This idea of interconnection. This is basic challenge of the posthuman. Yeah, the challenge to an idea of the human that is autonomous and independent, and instead proposing a concept of human that is embodied but embedded in relations and things with and through multiple connections to others. Now, these others, and these are different varieties of the impact of posthuman, this idea of posthuman. These others may be in terms of social. When you see, for instance, Judith Butler, she speaks of a subjectivity that is interconnected all the time, that there is no possibility of a subject that is alone or independent in society. Braidotti expands a little that concept to an interconnection not only with other persons, but also with other non-human beings, both organic and not organic, inorganic. Yeah. Let me break, take a break from Dystopias to comment on a book I just came across through a very good friend, Lydia Garcia, who introduced me to this book. And I'm still getting little parts of it, but it sounds so promising that I really wanted to share it with you. It's Braden Sweetgrass, yeah, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, and it's by a biologist, Robin Wall-Kimmerer, a biologist of Indigenous heritage. And what I find interesting in this book that is essay-like, it's not fiction, it's essays, but so personal and so intimate at times, but suddenly that personal and intimate expands to the whole world. The main idea I like about this, and I make a connection with posthumanism, is what is organic and what is inorganic. That is, she speaks of the language of animacy. And she, from what I've read so far, is she makes a connection, she makes a comparison between English and her native, her language from his ancestors, which she doesn't speak, but she started learning. And she discovered things like, for instance, in her language, her indigenous language, there is a word that names the power that makes a mushroom grow. And she says, there is no such thing in English. And she starts to discover that in her language, for instance, when referring to a table, for instance, you say, well, what is it? That is the what. But whenever you refer to water, to plants, to geography, to a gulf, to sand, you say, who is this? In her language. And I found that fantastic. It's simple. But I find it incredibly illuminating because that opens a view different about the world and about these interconnections with the organic and the inorganic. Well, what is the inorganic and what is the organic? You know? So she says, to be a hill, to be a sandy beach, to be a Saturday, all are possible ways in a world where everything is alive. The inanimacy of the world is something we already know, but the language of animacy teeters on extinction. So she works on language, even she speaks of the grammar of animacy. So she even for those of us who studied a language career, language course of studies, this is interesting. And what is mainly interesting is how the impact it may have. Learning the grammar of animacy could well be a restraint on our mindless exploitation of land. Yeah. So I think I wanted to share this with you. This was a sort of parenthesis from Dystopias, but nevertheless, I think it's relevant for the posthuman and the critique and the way in which interconnections are built. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to getting more information about this. So coming back to the posthuman and feminisms, and following Braidotti again, the two critiques, the critique to universal and the critique to species supremacy, are seen in these two movements of feminisms, delinking the subject from universality and decentering the subject. In favor of what? In favor of diversity, in favor of a nomadic, fluid, always changing and interrelated subject. Yeah? And dystopias are going to work on these ideas, and we're going to see, well, how they can manage to challenge these concepts. So I like, before we make the pause, I like to share some images. Today, before that, well, no, let me go on. I was going to add a comment about your talk, Emek, when you talked earlier in the way in which sometimes some Western feminists might take the role of, well, speaking of those poor victims in the East, and that also responds to the universal, I think, to the belief that, well, the universal that is challenged by the posthuman is a concept of a person that owns the knowledge and believes that that knowledge is owned by that person and not by others. And in that way, that person, that man, universal man, is endowed to have the authority in terms of the word. And so those others who do not have the knowledge should follow what that universal knowledge has. And that is part of feminisms as well, because it's not that you have the universal as a concept that is challenged and feminisms challenged in that concept. The universal was part of feminisms as well, yeah, especially in the liberal movements and in the generalization of woman in singular. And I think that what you referred to earlier has to do with this idea. So let me show you some images. Here we go. Toya Bonino is a filmmaker. I came across her again by chance. I didn't know her. I was reading a book chapter on posthumanism and feminisms written by Paula Fleisner, a professor at the University of Buenos Aires, and she used these images in her text, and I found that they were really good to illustrate some aspects of the posthuman. The one on the left is Ophelia from 2011. The second is Jauría from 2008. These are part of documentaries, short films, but I'm interested in the images as they appear. In the case of Jauría, because the term, even though the documentary does not speak of that, when we see the image and we see Jauría, what we imagine is that the chicken was killed by a pack of dogs, of hounds, and that may echo. Again, it's not a documentary. This is all triggered by the image and the title. It may echo those rapes carried out by groups of people, of men. The documentary is different. It has to do with the life of chicken and the way they are sacrificed, and well, different, but aesthetically placed in that position. On the left, the pig immediately reminds us of another image, or is supposed to close. The documentary, again, the film is short and it's not about Ophelia, but nevertheless, the title is Ophelia. And it may take us to John Everett Millais' Ophelia and to Shakespeare's Ophelia. So we begin to make connections between one image and the other. I have worked with Millais' painting in my classes of English literature and working with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Everett Millais was a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and we can see that filiation in the use of colors and the details, the accuracy in the details in the painting, but also in resorting to literature as a theme in the paintings, and also typical of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, presenting women as vulnerable and fragile, or as demons, like the two opposites. Here, Ophelia appears as innocent and a sort of cross in the figure of her arm, the shape that her arms take. But there's something erotic about the painting in the quality of the skin and the flowers, and then the whole colorful position and depiction. This painting was also taken by, John Everett Millais did not think of presenting this from the point of view of feminism, far from that, but in some way, that image was also taken by Sofia Coppola in The Virgin Suicides. And here in this image that hints at Ophelia, adds, and coming back again to virginity and the next talk, presents this patriarchal challenge of patriarchal policies that lead these children in the film. I'm not spoiling anything because the title is enough. These children to suffer the oppression from their parents and from religion. There's a strict religious people who force these girls to remain virgin, and they feel the oppression of that mandate. And there is no happy ending. But while this image introduces or takes echoes or takes Millais' representation of Ophelia in one of the daughters that kills herself. But Bonino, I think, takes it a step further. When we look at both at the two images, we immediately see the parallel, and it is as if Bonino has tried to recreate the atmosphere in Millais' painting, but replacing Ophelia by a pig. Why? One of the, I don't know exactly, but I think that one of the effects it has is by creating the same surrounding and just replacing, or mainly replacing the woman by the pig, there's a parallel and an equal position of the woman and the animal that might call our attention to the connection between animals and women. And that is part of the critique that some feminisms and ecofeminisms have made, making a connection between the way in which women are repressed, dominated, used, abused, and the same way in which the planet has been abused, dominated, etc., etc. So there is placing both of them here, one next to the other, stresses the interconnections between the human person in the figure of a woman here and the animal world in the figure of the pig. To stress that, on the one hand, that concept of man as universal and species supremacy, but species supremacy that is held by that male universal, is still present. And also by questioning about animals and animals' characters. Yeah? In Bonino's page, it is said that she creates alterity. Yes, she creates alterity with her films, often with animals like this. But it is an alterity that makes us reflect about other alterities. Yes? And we may question, well, what is the difference then between the human person and the animal? I'm not saying that we are the same. I'm not saying that it's exactly the same. But where is the limit between power, and where is the limit that endows one species the right to use and abuse the other? Yeah? And that has to do with the interconnections in that the posthuman places in with feminism. Yeah? The second group of images before the end of the first session is not taken by any feminist stance. It's Anthony Gormley. He's a sculptor. But I think that these images, his installations and his sculptures, help us visualize the concept of nomadic, the concept of fluidity in terms of subjecthood and identity. Yes. If we had to think of the challenge to universal, if we think of man as universal and a supreme species, if we had to draw that concept of man, we would probably draw a figure of a man, a male, and with clear borders, first of all, complete, erected, and with clear borders separating the body of that man and the rest of the world. Because that man that is challenged, that concept of man, is autonomous. But Gormley, who is from London, a London sculptor, breaks this notion of the body. His artwork usually works with the body and identity. Yeah? But in this view of the body is not complete, it's fractured, or is turned upside down. So there is a challenge to the completeness of man. And in that, I think that it reflects part of the challenge that the posthuman makes to that concept of universal. In the second one, that is quantum cloud. Quantum cloud, this is in London, but there are other images that appear smaller, similar sculptures in different exhibits. Yeah, and if you, I don't know how well you can see it in the slide, but in the center, the core, there is like the shadow of a human body. Yes, like the residue of a human body that it begins to expand outwards. This was from which I have no idea about digital art, how it works. Yeah, I mean, but the way it is explained is that this was created with a random algorithm, and that distributed the loops of steel, and the core is based on Gormley's body himself. And so this gives the idea of a body that begins to be dissolved, not only fractured and fragmented, but dissolved. And the fact that it is placed in the open air, I think it's also fantastic to see these concepts of fluidity, of change, and of interconnection. Because what we can see, where does the sculpture end? Well, the final line, let's say, of the loops of steel. So through the sculpture, we can see the sky, we can see the clouds, we can see a landscape that changes. We could even see the cable that is moving behind the sculpture. So the sculpture would change even at different times of the day, because it will be playing with the outer world. So it's an identity, a body that begins to expand outwards and begin to incorporate the world inside. And I thought that this could exemplify two ways in which the posthuman will appear in the novels. One has to do with the connection between the organic and the inorganic, the expansion of the concept of connections to a world of ecology that is with ecofeminisms. But also another way in which those two challenges, challenge to the critique to universality and the critique to the species supremacy, are also challenged by means of technology in dystopias. Yeah? And these are the two things I like to work with in the second part of the talk. So maybe we can have a first break, pause, so as to have to see if you have any questions, or there are some comments there. Well, Carola, I already read. And Mercedes says, it is funny how inclusive language is questioned and rejected from a large part of society, but using the masculine to include everyone, men and women, is not. Yes, yes. All these challenges take place. You know, I think that, and we may, the problem with changes is that they take time, and that those who want to make the change have also been nurtured by, we could say, patriarchy. I mean, we may want to change many things, but we were brought up with certain ideas that we have naturalized, and we have to work all the time against our own contradictions. You know? And the same happens in society. It takes time, and it takes a lot of work to introduce changes, I think. There's a comment there. It's funny how inclusive. Okay, this is, yes, this is Mercedes Fisher's comment. Good. Yes. And there's another comment here. Quantum cloud makes me think about how our identity is greatly influenced by new technologies, and almost in a dystopian kind of way, we are lost in these technologies. Yes. Well, in fact, we could say that we're going to see it in a minute. To some extent, we're all cyborgs, we could say. I mean, we have incorporated technology, even in minimum things like, I don't know, having a tooth implant, having aesthetic surgery. We have accepted technology on our bodies, not only in our lives, but in our bodies. Yeah, and that is one important aspect we have to see, well, and where the limit is between that technology and us. But it is true that technology has become part of our lives. Yes, I don't want to get lost with the comments. Let me see, I have to go back. So Hamid asked about new technologies, and almost in dystopian kind of way, we're lost in these technologies. Yes, I agree with you. We are giving it a lot of say. We have always to be aware of how much space we give it. Yeah, that's why I prefer to have a complementary view of both views, these expanding world to other connections that are not human, and the use of technology. I think that both have to be together, not only one of them. Let me see, there is another comment here, I think. Hello, Cecilia, could you expand on the relation between species? I was wondering how would be the relation between humans and animals according to posthumanism. It's not that there has to be a relation in terms of working together for something, but what posthumanism, this is a good question, yeah, because it's I think that posthumanism tries to show that there is no supremacy, in the sense that there is an equality between species. That does not mean that we have to, or that does not mean that, sorry, that there has to be an interaction with animals, but that animals and plant life are not here in the world for our service, not to be used. Yeah. And it calls our attention to the fact that we are one more species in the world. And I think that the important point here is that if we are only one more species, and then when we think of the human, we have to see how within that species, let's say, human, we also tend to make the distinction between one and the other. That is, in the same way as the posthuman proposes or questions the fact that the human should be interconnected with other species, it also calls our attention to the fact that the human should also be connected within the species, and in the same way, not in terms of supremacy. I don't know if I'm being clear, but the connection between human and animal tells us that we are just one more species in the world, that we are not the owners of the world. And the consequences of believing that we are the owners of the world are clearly seen in everyday life. We don't need to read dystopias to see that. Yeah, climate catastrophes are an example. Pollution. I mean, there are many things that take place in the world because man, the universal, has thought that they had the right to use the world. But that idea also forces us to see that the same inequalities we have exercised on the world are also part of the inequalities we have exercised among each other. And this is what I meant when I said, well, man is a universal that apparently includes everyone, but it doesn't include everyone because there are many groups that are not included in that universal. You know? If the concept of universal man is having certain power or certain exercising having certain possibilities in society, well, not all groups have been given the same possibilities. Yes, and so the same discrimination should be made inside what is human and outside what is human. Yeah. Cynthia, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question so well. Let me see if I'm skipping, because I can
there are a lot of questions here and there.
Let me see if I can manage to make this move. Yeah, there. If I skip any, please tell me. Mercedes, could species supremacy be the terminology that the patriarchy adopts to minimize the violence against women and minorities, to take the responsibility of itself, but not naming it men's supremacy? Species supremacy, I'm not sure whether that would be used by patriarchy to justify, because patriarchy justifies itself. Perhaps thinking of a different supremacy. I mean, patriarchy adopts to minimize the violence against women, not in terms of species supremacy, but on the belief that women do not have the same rights. And well, this is a long discussion and tradition of seeing women as inferior. You know, I'm not saying anything new here. The question is, how has patriarchy, I think a good question could be, how has patriarchy justified taking or placing women in an inferior position? And one of them is a biological source, you know, taking women as, in terms of biology, as in charge of reproduction. And this, and coming back to what Mercedes says, perhaps there is a connection, what you say, yeah, you're right in this, now that I'm thinking about it, in the sense that the reproduction, the biology of women might place her as a different species, closer to some animal, yes? And that gives man, the male person in patriarchy, get the justification to use women for reproduction. Yeah, we're going to see this in one of the novels. You saw it you read it in The Handmaid's Tale, but it's part of one of the novels we're going to discuss in the second part. And violence, well, yes, the violence, perhaps you're right, also Mercedes, in the sense that the violence that is used to justify the notion of species supremacy that justifies the violence against other species, the same concept might be used to justify the violence against women. Yeah? Perhaps not as species, but making women as different within the species. Yeah, for this question of the reproduction. Carola says, I remember, no.
There's a question by Sabrina. Thank you, Cecilia. This reminds me very much of Carol Adams' ideas. She talks about how the metaphors that express sexual violence against women refer to the world of animal abuse. Women being a piece of meat, for instance. This also challenges any hierarchy of species.
Good comment, Sabrina. Great contribution. Yes. All of them, in the same way as Mercedes has asked in this species supremacy, yes, this is also a good point. A way, the metaphor of women as meat, the metaphor of women as animals, in terms of the biology, yeah, not as a human person, but as a body to be used. Yeah, I think that also should be challenged. Yeah, and I think that posthuman also challenges that, because the question of challenging what posthumanism challenges in these two concepts, the universal and species supremacy. It is important that these two concepts are challenged, because they have a clear effect on our lives. Yes, it's not only a rhetoric, it's a question of having a clear effect. And as you said, Sabrina, often, and as Mercedes said earlier, these images are used to justify a violence. So women being a piece of meat, well, that justifies that that meat can be eaten. Yeah. I think that I skipped one. When I say dystopian kind of way, I mean how in the past dystopian stories would depict the future. I mean, I don't get your question. Maybe that was part of another comment. Maybe you can.
Yeah, this was a person that asked about or made a comment about the sculpture, the quantum.
Oh, okay.
So it was sort of referring back to her own question.
Okay, good, thank you. And that's it, I think. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I think there are no other comments or.
Good, thank you. So, what I find interesting about all this is how these concepts force us to reconsider the question of subjecthood, the question of identity, and how those concepts are really ingrained in our everyday life. I mean, that what we read in Dystopias from this point of view also makes us think about ourselves. So maybe we can turn to the second part. I think it's time now. Yes. So let me, I will not give you much information about the novels, but just enough for you to, for all of us to be able to follow these ideas. The first novel I'm interested in commenting in is He, She, and It, which is from 1991. Yeah, takes some time now. Which was published the following year, 1992, in the United Kingdom as Body of Glass. You know, different title, and it got an award there. Marge Piercy is and defines herself as an activist and a poet. I mean, she's a novelist, a poet, and an activist. And she has been involved in, as she says on her page, anti-war, feminist, and environmentalist issues. For a long time, the 1960s, she was fighting against the Vietnam War. She was part of the feminist movements, and she continues being part of many movements that have to do with peace, feminism, and the environment. The novel, I will tell you the plot of the novel briefly, not completely, you know, just enough. But I'd like to share here 3 questions that will guide my comments later. So I'm going to leave them here while I make the comment on the plot for you, for those who have not read it yet. The first one has to do with posthumanism, how, if the novel, if it breaks, and how with the notions of universality and species supremacy. The second has to do with the role of the figure of the cyborg. There are cyborgs in this novel. In what way the figure of the cyborg helps to discuss subjectivity, and what is the relevance of the structure. I'm going to reveal the structure in a minute. The novel is placed in the mid-21st century, not so far from now. It is in 2059. Of course, it was more in the future, it was far away in the future from 1991, but now it's not so far. And as it happens in most of these critical dystopias, the novel is characterized by the world being at a high level of pollution, really terrific pollution that makes it almost impossible to live in some parts of the world, by a great advance in technology, and by the absence of government. That is typical of the 1990s dystopias, the absence of a government, but the power residing in the hands of multinational enterprises or certain corporations. In this case, in the case of this novel, there are three main places. You have the multis or multinationals. You have free towns that are autonomous because they're advanced in technology, and so they have that as a power to sell technology, and that helps them to remain autonomous. But of course, there is a lot of piracy and conspiracy and violence and attacks between the multis and the free towns. And most of the population does not live in either place. They live in what is known as the globe, which is a vast extension of land that is almost uninhabitable because of the pollution, to the point that those people from the multis or the free towns that have to go outside and they have to cross the globe, or the people in the globe, when there are certain moments of the day in which they need a second skin to be able to survive the radiation, second skin, special clothing, but it's meaningful, it's wearing different skins. One of the protagonists, Shira, is a woman who was born and raised in a free town, moved to Malta when she got married and had a son, so she lived with her husband and son in a multinational. But when the novel starts, she has divorced and she has been denied the custody of her son in favor of her husband. So she leaves the multi and goes back to the free town to work with her grandmother, who is a scientist and who is working with Malka. Her grandmother is working with Avram, a scientist. They are producing cyborgs. One of the cyborgs they produce is Yod, who is created as a defense weapon, against the multis because of these attacks I just mentioned. The question is that Yod is programmed as a weapon, as a defense weapon, but he's also programmed by Malka. Malka does something that is not legal in the narrative, and it is to program the cyborg with emotions, with the need for connection, and with the capacity of self-reflection. So this will bring some issues in the novel. Shira, the protagonist, is in charge of helping him to socialize, teaching him how to socialize, and a love story develops. I'm just going to say this. There is a love story between Yod and Shira. I'm not going to spoil much of the, even though I'm going to spoil a lot later. But there's more to it, because Malka tells Yod, Malka, the grandmother, the one who programmed Yod in emotions and interconnections and self-reflection, tells Yod a story to teach him some things. And the story is a story that takes place in Prague in the 17th century, around 1600. And it's a story of a Jewish community that is being attacked by Christians. And so the rabbi creates a golem, Joseph, to defend the community. Obviously, the two stories become parallel, and the chapters are alternated. So we have part of the two stories developing together. And there's also a female character in the Jewish Prague that teaches Joseph to read and write, and then there's a love story there too. Yeah. So that is what I'm going to say about the plot so far. So how could this novel help us see the challenges to universality and species supremacy? I think, first of all, that there are some limitations, I would say, in the novel, especially in replicators and binaries that tend to be comfortable in the notion of universality. And I'm thinking mainly in the way in which Yod is programmed by Avram, the male scientist, as a defense weapon. And so the stress is in violence and strength. and is programmed into emotions by the female scientist. And so I think that the male-female here, this binarity is replicated, and in some way it is there. But it's just one part, because there are other ways in which the novel really breaks with binaries and breaks with these concepts of universal and superiority. One way in which the binary is broken is in the character of Riva. Riva is, I haven't mentioned Riva yet. I mentioned Shira and her grandmother, Malka. Now, Riva is Shira's mother, but she takes like a minor, not minor, but she comes and goes. She's not the main character from the beginning, and not even as a whole. She's a woman, but she's independent, autonomous. She's strong. She's an activist. Shira, her daughter, tends to conform more in the role of, or she's conforming more in the role of a traditional female role. But Riva, the mother, is more an activist. Yeah. And the fact that she's not the central character, the fact that she's in the margins is important in this breaking of the universal and superiority. Tom Moylan says about Riva, he says, Riva is not a leader. Rather, she is a self-effacing organizer, teacher, mediator, catalyst, one who helps to build a movement and moves on. Yeah? And in that, she's a character that breaks with the male-female. She's female, but she has male features in the traditional sense in that binary. So she breaks with that, with those stereotypes. And is really, as I said, an activist. There are other ways in which the novel can question this. And one way is how hierarchies, denouncing how hierarchies have led to this kind of world, the dystopian world, polluted, almost uninhabitable, characterized by violence and domination, the search for power. So the ferocity of the search for power has to do with hierarchies, and that is questioned by the novel because the result is this. And of course, the question of the planet as a subordinate, you know, the use that is being made of the planet. The second question is connected with the cyber. Now, how does the cyber help to discuss subjectivity? Well, when we speak of the cyber, of course, we have Yod, we have Joseph in the other story. There are other characters. There is Nili, that is a woman enhanced through technology. And that this is an important difference made in the novel. There are cybers that are machines humanized in some way, and there are humans that are, I don't know if the word could be machine, turned into machines, but they are not machines. They are enhanced through technology, added superpowers, if you want, some kind of superpowers or something that is outstanding for a human being. Yeah. Let me show you some quotation. Nili is this character, the woman that is enhanced, and Shira looks at her. She comes from Israel with Riva, and she says, "Is she human?" Looking at Nili. What kind of question is that? Riva asks. I didn't think she was an alien. Is she machine or human? That's a matter of definition. Where do you draw the line? And that is the main question. Where do we draw the line? Yeah? A possibility. Was she born from a woman? That's a start. Yeah? Where do we draw the line? That is the question that the novel poses. Where do we draw the line between machine and human in these cases? Is Nili machine or is she human? She's human originally, but she was enhanced in such a way. And Yor is originally machine, but he was humanized in such a way that he felt love, he reflected upon himself that was a growing process, obviously. And the figure of the cyborg then helps in the novel to question the drawing of the line between machine and human, but also the question of identities. And again, drawing the line takes us back to this idea of a quantum cloud, this identity expanding and outside a limit. Yeah. When Shira meets Yod for the first time, a cyborg, the cyborg, Abraham corrected in a pleased tone, this is what I've been working toward. You know? And she moves forward to touch its cheek. Yeah. But later on, when they start socializing, when they start sharing things and talking about feelings, Shira speaks of Yod as he and his. You know? So he becomes a he. In the use of pronouns in the novel, we can see the changes from the machine to the person. You know? I'm spoiling here parts of it, but it is important because Yod needs to destroy himself to save the free town, to save Malka and Shira and the free town from the attacks of the conspiracy of the Maltese. And Malka said to Nile, Yod was a mistake. You are on the right path, Nile. It's better to make people into partial machines than to create machines that feel and yet are still controlled like cleaning robots. Yeah? And Yod writes, I have died, or tells it on the screen, in fact. I have died and taken with me Avron, my creator in his lab, all the records of his experiments. I want there to be no more weapons like me. A weapon should not be conscious. I don't understand why anyone would want to be a soldier, a weapon, but at least people sometimes have a choice to obey or refuse. I had none. And so the question with the cyber here is, the question introduced with the cyber is not only where to draw the line, but having a choice seems to be one possible way of drawing the line is, well, is she born from a woman? Then the questions will go on. Is she born from a man? Yeah. Now, the question of being human or non-human here is having the choice to act. And Yod was given emotions, was given reflection, but he was not given a choice. Yeah. Nili, on the other hand, has her choice, even though she's enhanced as machine-like. But the cyborg unavoidably takes us to Donna Haraway's theory of the cyborg and her cyborg manifest. This is from 1985, and Donna Haraway speaks of the cyborg in a literal, but also in a metaphorical way. In a literal, but also in a metaphorical way. That is, she speaks of science fiction, she speaks of the figure of the cyborg as a combination of organism and machine, but not referring only to the cyber as a robot. You know? What she sees in the metaphor of the cyber is a figure that is disruptive in the established order, a figure that could be seen by the established order as a monstrous figure, but that comes to disrupt what is naturalized. So the cyber is connected to denaturalization, with fluidity, with this erasure of boundaries. You know, where to draw the line? There is no clear boundary here. That is a way of challenging, the human concept of universal and supremacy. Yeah. Let me read you a short quotation from Haraway. We are all chimeras, theorized and fabricated hybrids. of machine and organism. In short, we are cybers. The cyber is our ontology. It gives us our politics. The cyber is condensed image of both imagination and material reality. The two joint centers structuring any possibility of historical transformation. And the cyber is a metaphor that could also be used to refer to the object, to the eccentric, from that universal, from that center, autonomous, independent, male, universal. Well, the object is the one that is outside that. That could be represented metaphorically by the cyber. Yes? And so the novel, by introducing the cyber figure or the mythical Joseph, questions or poses these questions about where to draw the line and where are the boundaries, where are the borders, should they be erased, how? Yes, it interpolates the naturalized order of patriarchy. Yeah, and the third question I had, let me move on so we have time for the other novel. What is the relevance of the structure? These interwoven stories, of course, it helps the narrative. But what I found most interesting is the way in which a story that is placed in the past, in the 1600s, becomes so relevant for the future world in science fiction. And this is not only he, and it. This is another important feature of the critical dystopias, the use of the past and the use of memory as a central element of the narrative. Memory becoming important in the narratives, not as a way of remembering, but a memory as becoming an integral part of who we are. Bradbury says that understanding one's subjectivity is a process which interacts, negotiates, and transforms through time, a time in which memory is structural. Yes? We see this in novels. For instance, in this novel, by the use of the past story. In other novels, there is the use of slavery as a metaphor. In other texts, it's keeping diaries. I mean, there is the importance of the recording of the past, but not as fixed, but as something that really keeps us moving and helps us understand who we are. That is the importance of memory. Yeah. An aspect I have been researching has to do with time in these dystopias and post-apocalyptic dystopias. And what I see is that another way of questioning the accepted notion of human, that posthumanism, that challenge that posthumanism makes, can also be seen in questions of time. Because we have in dystopias the interpellation of what is known as chrononormativity, that is a notion of time that implies a logical sequence, a binary perspective, and the idea of progress. But that is interpellated in the dystopias, which propose a polychrony, a kind of polyphony, but a polychrony of times. And those times are fluctuating, traverse, complex, overlapping. Very common in dystopias to have what I like to see as a palimpsest, a temporal palimpsest, a time palimpsest, the present and the present overlapping, but not as a memory, but as becoming present at the same level. Yeah? And that is a way in which these novels question the normativity in terms of time. Yeah? But it's the same challenge. So let me move on to the second novel, which offers a different, similar perspectives and different perspectives. I mean, there are no cyborgs here. Louise Erdrich is from Minnesota and is of mixed origins, an interesting mixture of origins. German American on the side of her father and Native American on the side of her mother. Yeah. And so this blending of ancestry is revealed, is clearly seen and worked with in this novel, because the main protagonist is also of Native ancestry, but she's an adopted child, and so she's brought up, raised by a non-native family. Yeah. Edric is also a very prolific writer, as FaHCE, and we can count almost 30 books, fiction, non-fiction, and poetry. Again, both authors share a variety of genres. Now, the questions. I'm going to use as a guide for the comments after this. What role do the different origins play in Cedr's identity, and how does this contribute to the discussion of posthumanism? Devolution and time. We're going to see these when I tell you the plot, or some part of the plot, and how they connect. And if there is a utopian impulse in such a moment of darkness, yeah, vulnerability and darkness. So let me briefly tell you. So Cedar Hawk Songmaker, that is the name of the character, the main protagonist. Now, that is the name given by, it's very ironic in some ways. That is the name given by her adopted parents. Yeah, a couple of white liberals. And she grows up believing, she knows she's adopted child, she knows her native ancestry, but she has always thought that that was a mark of uniqueness, and she felt proud of that in her childhood because she felt that she was original in some way. Later, she realizes that she's not. When she goes to college, she realizes that she's ordinary because there are many people like her. And the disappointment comes a little further when she learns that her biological mother is Mary, called her Mary Potts. And it's not only that Mary is an ordinary name and not having any native mark, but the whole family is full of Marys. Her mother, her grandmother, and her half-sister are all Marys, Mary Potts. So this is part of her comments earlier. The question is why she visits her biological mother. Well, because she's pregnant. Because, not the mother, I mean, Cedar, the protagonist, is pregnant. And so she wants to see if there is anything she should worry about in the biology about her child. Why is she so worried about this? Because of something that is happening in the world. And it is that evolution has stopped. And apparently, evolution is reversing. So there is evolution or devolution. There is a reversal, the beginning of evolution being reversed. This is reflected or has many consequences. At the beginning, as we learn all this through Cedar herself, we don't get much information, but we know that something is happening because there are new creatures appearing, new birds and new plant life appearing in the garden and in the surroundings, sort of prehistoric birds, big birds appearing, but also because there are rumors about some problems being happening with the babies that are being born. Yes, we don't know exactly what it is, but there is something in this reversal of evolution that is becoming manifest in the newly born babies. So she's afraid of her own baby. But when she visits, she thinks of visiting her mother just to ask that and come back. But she gets involved with the family. And this is a journey she starts into her own identity and into discovering her own heritage. Yeah. I don't want to give you much information after this. Well, the other The novel is written in terms of a diary that Sida writes to the unborn child. I mean, she writes, the whole novel is a diary she writes to her child that is going to be born. Yeah. The first part of the novel deals with these appearances, these births, these changes in society, these rumors that pregnant women are being observed and are being taken away, so hiding first. And when she cannot hide, oh, thank you, Laura. Oh, sorry, because you wrote it in the chat, was probably, thank you. Well, she hides first, but then she is taken as a prisoner. You know, I mean, pregnant women are being taken as prisoners, and so the second part of the novel is really dark, more in the Handmaid's Tale-like tone. If women used to to see whether the babies that are born are normal, and so they are immediately taken from the mother, and the mother is used to get more children, to get pregnant once and over again. Yeah, that is the plot. I'm spoiling most of it, but it's worth reading anyway. How can we answer these questions? Well, the different origins clearly will break stereotypes that the same Sida has. And it's interesting that her own stereotypes have to do, well, I have native heritage, there is some healing power in my family, my family have died in a reservation. I mean, there are many fantasies that Sida has, which are broken the moment she meets her parents, not only because she is known Mary, as many of her women in her family, as all of the women in her family, but they're also bourgeois. They are not even poor, and that breaks the stereotypes she may have of the family and of the heritage. The other way in which the connection between devolution and time, the other way in which the posthuman is challenged, this question of species supremacy, well, by the fact that when devolution begins to take place, the most terrifying thing that people can think of is that they were going to become the man in the caves. Yeah? To which Sida says, but the man in the cave appeared so much later in the evolution. Yeah, and that opens a view of the interconnections between different species, between the human and the different species. That is clearly presented in the novel. And she even, I skipped some of this. Here. Creationism bites the dust, big time. This is Sida, right? Yeah. I look at the landscape yard in the failing light and wonder how the birds will turn out. I know that we've come to the end of science. Human beings might be saved by science, It might happen. But I'm quite sure even then, there will be no true explanation. If evolution has reversed, we'll never know why, any more than we know why it began. It is like consciousness. We can tell everything about the brain except why it exists and why it thinks about itself. And well, this is a point in common with a cyborg having a conscience and reflection. So the more I consider all of this, the more it seems that our predicament would be best addressed by an acknowledgement of the anima mundi, the soul of the world. And I think that here is the connection between the human species and the world, not in terms of supremacy. And I think that we can see it here, yes, in this circle of evolution. The anima mundi speaks of a soul in the world in which all the species are equal. And so there is no supremacy. And that is a big challenge to the species supremacy. one brief comment before we turn to our final questions, and it has to do with whether there is some hope. Yes? Well, it's a very dark novel, much darker than He, She, and It. Yeah? But there is this idea that she sees an empty field sometime planted that reads Future Home of the Living God. That is the title of the novel. It's just a bare field, fallow and weedy, stretching to the pale horizon. And the image of the pale horizon may be a positive line, which in the end, at the end of the story, she writes to her son. The baby has been taken from her. And she says she's dreaming that he's safe, that a friend took the baby. And she says, I sing your song. My guardian spirit has returned. Yeah. And so there is some little hope, although I think it's very little light. There is some hope that if we really, if the anima mundi, if the soul of the world is taken into consideration, this will pass and there will be a different kind of world. And my final comment, in terms of history and time, there is, at the moment, she reads an anthropologist who speaks of, questions the notion of progress and evolution. And he says, history creates this idea of progress. It's a construction, the idea of progress, because evolution never went forward or backward. It moves always forward, backward, and sideways. Yeah? It is our human perception of seeing it forward and now thinking that it's going backward to the original point. Yeah? So the novel is full of questions that might have an answer or not, but at least they are opened as questions about what we think about the human species. Yeah, and I stopped talking so that you can ask me any questions in these 12 minutes we have. Let me see if I can, I don't know how to see it. Shall I stop sharing so I can see the chat if there is anything here? Yeah. There are two, Barbara says, there are two interesting concepts regarding humans and robots, cyborgs and androids. Cyborgs are typically human or living beings with integrated machine parts, while androids are robots and or machines that are built and programmed to look and behave like humans. Yes, and that is made. That distinction is made in the novel. I didn't get into it, but there is a distinction made in the novel. But the metaphorical cyborg, I think, would apply to all of them, even to the mythical figure of Joseph, yeah, as a disruptive figure that questions the boundaries between human and non-human. Yeah, good, Barbara. Is that the only question?
So far?
Okay,
yeah.
Good. Oh, good. I thought there were many, so I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
So in between, I can say some things I have not. No, this question of evolution and involution or devolution, I think it's interesting. And remember what I said about the speed of change and how the development in technology makes that imagined world seems like closer and closer to our world more rapidly. I think that perhaps the notion of evolution reversing seems more unusual, or seems like more strange to us now than a cyborg. Yeah, and I think it's a good way of creating estrangement in the novel. How to imagine the same in the narrative. There are many theories discussed because there are many. Siddhar's adopted parents are intellectuals, and so they read and they discuss these theories about evolution, about the man in the caves, and about time, whether we are going to become simians or not. So I think that's interesting, yeah, as a way of creating estrangement, I mean. Mm.
Dolores Aicega says, thank you, Emek and Cecilia. What a nice way to finish the working week.
Thank you, Dolores.
Sure.
It's always good to finish the working week, yeah, isn't it?
Yes.
Good, good.
I was wondering, possibly in the first part of your talk, do students get engaged when you deal with these texts in class, or
for dystopian novels? Yes, really involved in all dystopian novels. I haven't worked FaHCE on it yet. I'm going to work it this year. I worked it a long time ago, yeah, but working it this year. But yes, they get involved with Octavia Butler's The Power of the Sower. That's one they love. Well, The Handmaid's Tale, we don't work it in class necessarily, but it comes into discussion often. And yes, they get involved in this. And the novels prompt many questions and reflections about, for instance, in Octavia Butler's Power of the Sower, this question of slavery, the metaphorical use of slavery, and the different minorities fighting for survival, and the power that the protagonist gets, or the notion of becoming, yeah, el devenir, the becoming that the novel presents. These are issues, and they immediately make a connection with feminisms and with their with patriarchy and against patriarchy. So they get involved. Yes. Let's see. We'll see how it works with cyborgs. Yeah.
there is a
in relation to the rapid shifts in the example of the belts you gave earlier, remember I read that when I was 14. At that point, the concept felt more foreign to me than it would now, and I'm 21. Yes, but in 7 years, things change in your life. You know, you see how it became familiar. Yes, imagine how foreign it felt in the 1950s. Yeah, I had not been born. Yeah, but I know it was foreign. But yeah, even not only in the 50s, but even later, those things appeared as pure fantasy, pure imagination. It was something to be a rumor, or perhaps to be seen on a movie or to be seen on cartoons, but not as possible or likely. Yeah. And that's why I think that the issue of involution maybe is a good way of creating estrangement, because, well, let's hope we don't have that so much. We have not discussed that so much, I think, as the question of technology and cybers. Yeah, and the way in which technologies, our bodies are intervened by technology. That is something that Marge Piercy has discussed, not only in this novel, but she has a novel from the 1970s, 1976, I think, Woman, singular, Woman on the Edge of Time. That's a utopia, you know, because there is a time travel to a utopian world in the future. But in between, in that time travel, the protagonist gets lost in some in-between place. And that in-between is a dystopia. Yeah? A dystopia in which the lower classes that were living in the farthest underground part of the city were used for transplant, or for transplants, so for organs. I mean, they were raised and taken care of, they survived just to be used for transplants. And so you can see how these people are so affected by technology, and how in that mid-world the question of we are all cybers was literally presented with all the interventions that bodies had. Yeah? So I think that that also shows this question of the cyber. You know, we are all cybers in some way. Yeah? And it's good that we are, if a cyber is a disruptive figure, if the cyber is someone that erases boundaries and questions, well, we're glad to be, yeah? Even if it's metaphorically. Okay, I don't think there are any other questions.
No.
Great ideas for writing. Thank you.
Thank you for all the comments. Yeah,
Yeah,
really good comments, and they also help. Yeah.
Constanza is saying thank you, and Carola. And
Yes, I could read them.
Belen.
Yeah. Thank you all for.
So they know we are reading. Yeah, Arabella,
greetings.
Congratulations, Ceci, and congratulations to the four of you. You have lit up 2 autumn/winter afternoons/evenings with attentive, lucid views, ideas, networks, bridges. We all appreciate when we leave a class full of answers, but with questions, even better.
With questions,
Question, reflection, even a little bit of insomnia is okay for new work, for new papers. So thank you very much.
Thank you again. Yeah.
Thank you.
So,
thank you all.
Thank you all in YouTube. Thank you for being there.
Everyone. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Ignacio.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.